Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name is Beth Cohen, and today we'll be talking about the impact of the expat community in Barcelona. Barcelona has a growing community of international residents, which, for better or for worse, is changing the face of the city. This week on Filling the Sink, we find out who they are, why they chose this part of the world to start a new life, and what impact they're having on the city. Joining me in the studio today is Lorcan Doherty. Hello, Lorcan.
Hello, Beth.
Thank you for joining me. Now, Lorcan, the term expat is very broad and quite vague. So to me, it brings to mind maybe stereotypes of English teachers, retired Brits and insular communities on the Costa Dorada, maybe living in little cultural bubbles. Could you specify what an expat is and how this profile differs from that of a migrant, a digital nomad, or simply a tourist?
Well, it's really hard to say exactly what an expat is. Compared to the other categories you mentioned then, well, tourists obviously stay for very short stays. Digital nomads as well, as the name suggests, they move around a lot. Expats maybe not so much. And how does it differ from a migrant? Well, an expat is a migrant. It's as simple as that. Expats are immigrants. But you have certain race and class associations with the word expat and migrant in some places. Bluntly, the perception does exist that expats are white in some people's heads, and this is obviously very problematic.
That is shocking. So basically, and racism aside, we're talking about citizens from first world countries or regions with a higher GDP than Catalonia, including but not limited to, for example, the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK or Northern Europe, who've come to Catalonia by choice.
Yeah, that's one definition. And there might also be subtle differences between the way the term expat is used in, say, British English compared to American English, or even between English and, say, Catalan and Spanish, because it also has, the English word has kind of worked its way into Catalan as well.
So each language has its nuances.
Exactly.
Now, to help us out, I've found some definitions. And according to the Style Guide of Trescat, Catalonia's public broadcaster, an expat is a person with a certain purchasing power and often with higher education who resides outside their country, generally temporarily and for professional reasons. But you could pick that apart a bit, because what about people who come to retire or stay permanently? Are they still expats?
Yeah, or, people without higher education but who have a high income, or people from a rich country but who've got a low income themselves.
It's very complicated. And I've got another definition here. So according to Barcelona-based anthropologist Jose Mansilla, expats are migrants with good salaries and good passports.
Yeah, that's a funny one, isn't it?
Well, actually, Lorcan, this sounds a bit like us.
Well, good salaries, I'm not sure. Good passports, well, I've got an EU passport, so we've got freedom of movement to come here anyway. Your case?
Well, my case is somewhat different because I am actually a Spanish citizen. So when it became clear that I was planning to stay permanently in Spain, I became nationalised and I actually lost my British passport.
Right.
Now, that was pre-Brexit, and in hindsight, it was a good decision because I do still have a European passport.
Yeah, well, and I'm lucky I've got my Irish passport as well. But, I mean, going back to the definition of an expat, generally temporarily here, well, I don't think that would include me. I think I'm here for the long haul. Come for professional reasons? That's not really true either, So, I don't really self-identify as an expat, but I guess other people might consider me an expat.
And also having a Spanish or Catalan partner probably facilitates the cultural integration a bit more.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
So to find out more about the cultural phenomenon of expats, you spoke to geographer Brian Rosa, who's a researcher and university professor at the Autonomous University of Barcelona.
Yeah, had a great chat with Brian. He's originally from the US. He's been living in Barcelona for 7 years. Together with his colleague, Antonio López Gay, he has done specific research, including surveys and focus groups on the topic of expats in Barcelona.
Let's listen to that interview.
Expats, if we want to use the term, fall as a subsection of migrants or immigrants. It's only cultural discourses that determine that they're something different.
Brian and I are chewing over the question, what is an expat? He notes the racial and class connotations of the word, preferring in his research in Barcelona to focus on the broader population of highly qualified international residents. Brian agrees that expat normally refers to an international migrant who speaks English, although it doesn't have to be their first language, who has moved by choice, usually from a wealthier country.
But beyond that, it's challenging. I mean, we did find in our research that people who have the same type of educational profile, so let's say they have at least a bachelor's degree and who come, say, from Latin America, are less likely to self-identify as expats than people from, say, North America or from Europe. But we also found people who work in the tech industry who came here from India and very much self-identify as expats.
Top motivations for moving to Barcelona among the people who took part in the survey include quality of life, cultural offer, the ability to get around the city without a car, and the Mediterranean climate.
Another thing that we asked were what were the least appealing aspects of moving to Barcelona. And what we found were the top two least desirable elements of the city were the cost of living and the impacts of tourism on the city. Which I find quite interesting in the sense that the impacts of tourism and the cost of housing also routinely come up as the biggest concerns of people who are from here.
One irony Brian points out is that although the majority of the survey group had neutral or negative attitudes towards the level of tourism in Barcelona, most had already visited the city before as tourists themselves. Barcelona City Council and the Catalan government both openly try to attract what they call international talent. But it is at the level of the Spanish state that Brian thinks the real blind spot is in this debate about the impact of highly qualified international residents in places like Barcelona. He mentions the Golden Visa, now being phased out, and the Beckham Law.
So essentially what this means is that people who are in the same income brackets, for example, in Barcelona, someone coming for the United States, for example, would have their income tax capped at 24%, when people in that same income range who are Spanish citizens might be paying up to 48% in their income taxes. So that not only has the impacts of unfairness or injustice in some sort of sense, but it also has major impacts in terms of the housing market, both in terms of what people can be able to afford to pay by not having to pay so many taxes, or their ability to be able to purchase a property, which they might not have been able to do otherwise. And one thing that we found about the Beckham Law recipients from our surveys is that people who are receiving these tax benefits for the ability to live and work in Spain, at least in the case of Barcelona, they're less likely to intend to stay long-term than the others. So a strategy is actually to come to Spain, live and work in Barcelona, pay less taxes, live for, say, 2, 3, 5 years, and then at the point in which they no longer have those tax benefits, return to their country of origin or move elsewhere.
Rental contracts in Spain break down into 3 types. Airbnb type short-term rentals, which last less than 1 month, seasonal rentals between 1 and 12 months, and leases of over a year. These long-term leases are protected by the Spanish right to housing law. However, the introduction of this law in 2023, along with the earlier 2020 Catalan housing law, which was later overturned by the courts, has led to some unexpected consequences in Barcelona.
Landlords strategically decided that they would take advantage of this loophole in regulation between 1 month and a year and convert what would have been, in many cases, long-term housing units to seasonal lets. One might say, and it's certainly true to an extent, that they were treating so-called expats as the target market for these leases, which was ultimately reducing the supply and inflating the price of housing. That had the impact not only of driving housing inflation overall, it had the impact of people from here not having access to as many properties. There weren't as many long-term properties on the market, and sometimes forcing people who don't fit the profile of the short-term resident into these much more exploitative contracts, which are oftentimes double the cost of a normal long-term rental.
It's easy to point the finger at expats here, but Brian argues it's perhaps more important to focus on who profits: the property owners, the majority of whom are from Catalonia and Spain. Expats, like tourists, have an undoubted impact on the city's housing, commercial offer, street culture and language, which leads to tension, misunderstandings and polarisation, Brian says. But the cultural discourse around expats supposedly not wanting to integrate or coming to Barcelona because they see it as a cheap place to live was not supported by the results of their research.
There's a high desire to become more involved with local neighborhood culture and society. The key barrier to this is the often stated desire to learn Catalan. A lot of the people that we surveyed or interviewed either spoke some Spanish or spoke Spanish fluently, but in most cases either didn't speak Catalan or didn't speak very much Catalan. So it seems pretty clear to me from this research that there needs to be, for example, more investment in providing classes for Catalan for people who actually seek to live and better integrate themselves within society in Barcelona.
Thank you to Professor Brian Rosa for speaking with us. Lorcan, as Brian mentions, language is key in terms of cultural integration. So for expats to truly become Catalan citizens, an effort's needed both on their behalf, but also by the government in terms of investment in language programmes.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we actually did a podcast in January about international residents learning Catalan, so that's one to check out if you haven't already.
And I also think it's important to mention that Brian's research is based on a section of the population who voluntarily chose to participate in a survey and therefore might favour certain profiles who were predisposed to help.
Yeah, exactly. A bit of a disclaimer. Brian himself said that this was a self-selecting group of people who completed a 15-minute survey about their experiences as highly qualified international residents. So we might have a little bit of bias towards people who want to be more civically involved in the city than the overall expat population as a whole, if you want to put it like that.
Now, so far we haven't talked about how many expats there are in Barcelona, other than a lot. Look, do you have the figures?
Well, no, because if we can't say what they are, then we can't say how many they are, but we can have a bit of a guess. It's not a neat, well-defined category, but around 125,000 residents of Barcelona in 2022 were highly qualified international migrants who had moved to the city in the previous decade. This figure's probably gone up as, we've moved on from the COVID pandemic, but among those people, should they be called expats? Many of them include people from Latin America, for example, who typically are not called expats or typically don't self-identify as expats, certainly.
Perhaps that's because of the language. I'm guessing if they already have native Spanish, that reduces the language barrier.
Yeah, when we think of expats, we probably think of them speaking in English among themselves. A different way of looking at it is that Barcelona is home to more than 86,000 people from countries with a GDP per capita above Spain's. We actually did an article on Catalan News looking at this group, which has quadrupled over the last 25 years. Italy, France and the UK are the main countries of origin. Outside Europe, United States and Japan. So while we maybe can't say the exact number, we can say that the number of expats is growing.
And I think the concept of expat has connotations of impermanence, the idea that people haven't really cut their ties with their country of origin and will eventually leave. Do you have any statistics on who leaves and why?
Well, Brian said to me that it's hard to get exact reliable data on this, but there does seem to be a transient population, people who don't stay for more than, say, a few months. But as he pointed out, that a lot of these people don't leave by choice, which again might not fit into our perceptions of expats. People might leave because of the precarity of the labour market, because of the cost of living. So that's the same issues that are facing locals, if you like. And thinking about job security, some of the most secure jobs in Catalonia are in the public sector, but these are the exact jobs that are difficult for the international community to access due to, for example, the need for fluent Spanish or fluent Catalan.
So perhaps people come, they try their luck, but they don't really succeed in learning the language, or at least not well enough to get a job, and then they just move on and try their luck elsewhere.
I think that happens in some cases, certainly. Also, another surprise, perhaps, in their research was that around 30% of the people that they surveyed had an income level that was lower than the median income level for Barcelona as a whole. So, well, that means the majority still earned more, but 30% is a sizable minority. And so I think that kind of points to the fact that expats, yes, are a privileged subsection of migrants, but that they also face some of the same challenges that all migrants face compared to the local population.
For example, going through the odyssey of trying to get a NIE number.
Yeah, the joys of Spanish paperwork. Voting rights is another one where, expats are like any other migrants.
So the impact of the expat community in Barcelona is felt in many different ways, culturally, socially, economically. And the proliferation of expats, particularly in major cities such as Barcelona and Girona, is also worth mentioning. There's a big expat community there. This has meant changes for the local population, and it's also influenced the housing market, the jobs market, and the character of certain neighbourhoods. While some of these changes have been positive, it's also brought problems, especially in terms of housing and the gentrification of some areas of the city. So, Lorcan, what do the locals think of all this?
Well, to find out, I spoke to Toni Coll. He's a member of the board at the Poblenou Residents Association. Poblenou is one of the areas of Barcelona most popular with expats. It's home to the 22 district, or 22 at district, which is this former industrial area transformed now into a tech digital innovation district. Toni is from Barcelona. He's been living in Poblenou for 14 years, and I started by asking him to explain a little bit about his neighbourhood.
El barri del Poblenou és un barri originalment obrer, originalment popular.
Poblenou was originally a working class area that grew up around big industrial manufacturing companies, Toni tells me. The 92 Olympics brought massive change to the area, opening up the beaches, removing train tracks and cleaning up slums. The next major transformation of the neighbourhood came with the 22 at urban plan, and that's where our expats come in.
Per expat, nosaltres aquí al barri entenem les persones migrants d'altres països, sobretot europeus.
From Toni's point of view, expats are people who have migrated from other countries, especially Europe and the United States, who have come here to work for technology companies that have set up in the 22 at district. And are there many of them? I ask.
N'hi ha molts. Sí, n'hi ha molts. Però és lògic,
There are lots, Toni laughs, which is logical, he says. They come to work in the tech companies and can afford to buy or rent properties that locals can't. Landlords are massively increasing their prices every year, and because they're not being properly regulated, they're functioning basically like tourist flats, Toni says.
El dia a dia és evident que ha canviat, Vull dir, nosaltres...
Day-to-day life in the neighbourhood has clearly changed, according to Toni. The economic level in the area is going up, he says, with commerce increasingly catering to expats rather than the traditional neighbourhood residents. Now we're full of shops operating in English, co-working spaces and, he says in English, coffee bakeries. It's also noticeable in schools. Expats' children are attending public schools in the neighbourhood, which we think is good, Toni says, but this also affects staff who have to teach students who don't speak Catalan or Spanish. But the crux of the problem, according to Toni, is a lack of public investment, particularly in housing.
Aquí el que no s'ha produït és la inversió pública que el 22 prometia.
The public investment that the 22 Ad project promised has not materialised. We fought a lot for public housing in the plan and its revisions, Toni explains, but only a small amount has been created. On the other hand, luxury private housing has been built, usually with ridiculously high prices, he says, and this has caused this demographic change in the neighbourhood. Meanwhile, the people who were living here and the children of the neighbourhood residents have to leave because they can't afford to rent or buy homes here.
Volem inversió, sobretot en habitatge. Creiem que...
We want investment, especially in housing, Toni says. We believe that if we create a pool of public rental housing in the neighbourhood, the demographic imbalance that has been created can be addressed. But we also want dialogue, he adds. Big private lobbies have the power to influence the government and council, but we don't. That's why we created a group, the Poblenou Housing Rights Platform, to establish ourselves as a force to exert pressure so the nice words from the administrations can translate into clear, direct public action.
Per tant, espero que per fi, diguem-ne, l'administració faci política d'habitatge de manera clara.
I hope that, finally, the administration implements a clear housing policy, Toni says. We believe it is the foundation to address the social and demographic changes occurring in the neighbourhood.
Thanks to Toni Coll for speaking with us. So, on a brighter note, as well as the negative connotations that we've just explored, the presence of an international community in Barcelona has also brought many benefits, especially from a business perspective.
Yeah, so we've established that there are highly qualified international residents that are coming to Barcelona. Now, the city has several initiatives to welcome them. There's Barcelona International Welcome Desk. There's Barcelona International Community Day, which we've done several podcasts on. And actually, during the pandemic, it was interesting that that was replaced by an online Barcelona Expat Week. So the council uses this term expat, although, some people do deem it a bit controversial.
Yes, and of course, there are also the businesses that cater to this particular socioeconomic group. I mean, we've done a previous podcast on brunch bars in Barcelona, which are often frequented by tourists, but also popular amongst expats. And we've also done a podcast on international schools, which have doubled in the last decade. And of course, that has nothing to do with tourists.
Yeah, and in a similar vein, there is the phenomenon of co-working spaces, which are known in Catalan as co-workings, which I think is quite funny. They obviously don't solely cater to expats, but this community does form a significant part of their client base.
Lorcan, you've visited a co-working space called Cloudworks to find out to what extent their business relies on international residents.
Yeah, I spoke to Marta Gràcia. She's the CEO at Cloudworks. The company was founded 10 years ago and it manages co-working and flexible spaces, they say. They've got 13 locations in Barcelona and another 2 in Madrid, and they serve around 3,000 members. So they've just opened up some new premises in the Alborn neighbourhood of Barcelona. And as Marta told me, it's pretty close to the city centre, but it's also near the beach. So they plan to attract freelancers, expats, and people who run their own businesses.
Let's hear what Marta has to say.
More or less 50% of our members are Spanish. It's true that international members, most of them are from France, Italy, the UK as well, and then from Latin America. I mean, our business relies mostly on corporates and local businesses or international companies that are based here. So not on expats as individuals, but expats that work from international companies that are here. So the profile is a bit different. What they bring through our spaces is diversity, culture. They're really involved in all our activities when they come because they want to connect, they want to interact with other people. So even if they are here for a shorter stay, they get really, really involved in the community. We always try to get to know who are our neighbors, especially when we have terraces and we do networks and parties. We try to see who our neighbors are, and sometimes we even invite them to our spaces to get to know them, to get our phone numbers, so they get in touch if something goes wrong.
Thanks to Marta Gràcia for speaking with us. It's really great to hear that Cloudworks is fomenting a sense of community among recent arrivals in the city. So, Lorcan, Barcelona isn't unique in terms of the boom in its expat community. What's happening in other cities?
No, you're right. This phenomenon is definitely being repeated in a lot of Southern European cities, also in places like Eastern Europe, Latin America and Thailand. We have cities and national governments competing to try and attract this segment of the global population, as Brian Rosa actually told me, through marketing and through tax breaks. And these places are places that often have tourist appeal anyway and have strong global connections. So there is that overlap between the lifestyles of tourists and of what we're calling expats, which leads to some of the social conflicts that we've discussed.
So elsewhere, as in Barcelona, expat communities are being linked to issues with housing, with street culture, public space and language, particularly concerns about the dominance of English. And these debates, particularly those about integration and local identity, are ongoing and complex.
Yeah, they're not going to go away. I do think it's maybe slightly ironic that we're sitting here doing a podcast here in Barcelona in English about expats. But I like to think that we do our bit at Catalan News on Filling the Sink to help, international arrivals learn more about Catalan culture and integrate into the local community. As the name of the podcast, of course, is Filling the Sink.
De mica en mica s'omple la pica.
Exactly. So little by little, the sink fills up, and that's what we aim to do. Each episode, you learn a little bit more about some aspect of Catalan culture.
And become a bit less of an expat and a bit more of a local.
There we go.
That's almost all we have time for today. But before we go, it's time for our Catalan phrase of the week. Lorcan, what do we have?
Val més un veí a la porta que un parent a Mallorca.
A neighbour at the door is worth more than a relative in Mallorca. That's a lovely saying.
Yeah, I think for expats, you might think having connections locally can be more helpful than having the support of relatives who are far away.
Whether that be in Mallorca or elsewhere. This week on Filling the Sink, we've been talking about the impact of the expat community in Barcelona. Thank you to Brian Rosa, Toni Coll and Marta Gràcia for speaking with us. And of course, thank you to you, Lorcan, for joining me here in the studio.
Pleasure.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. We'll be back again next Saturday with another exciting episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of all the team here at Catalan News, I'm Beth Cohen, wishing you a great weekend. Fins aviat. Adeu.